Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. It is my pleasure and honor to welcome you to today's webinar on the 47th regular session of the UN Rights Council Virtual Roundtable, Human Rights and Anti-Corruption, the impact of the rule of law and good governance for building back better. Today, we will have an array of expert panelists joining us for this presentation. But first and foremost, I would like to welcome to the floor Mr. Nikhil Seth, the UN's Assistant Secretary General and Executive Director at UNITAR. Mr. Seth, it is my honor to welcome you.
Thank you so much. And excellencies, distinguished panelists, wonderful participants, ladies and gentlemen, it is a great pleasure for me to welcome you all on behalf of UNITAR to this virtual roundtable. And it's an honor, of course, to join so many distinguished speakers in this event, which is a platform for launching the e-learning course on anti-corruption and human rights in the framework and in the wings of the 47th regular session of the Human Rights Council. Well, we all know that several efforts have been made to combat corruption. However, there are persistent and new challenges which arise in all societies, regardless of what stage of development these societies are in. We strongly believe at UNITAR that mainstreaming knowledge about corruption through initiatives like this e-learning and this event pursues the transformation of discriminatory social institutions, laws, cultural norms, and community practice, which limit the full realization and enjoyment of human rights. In order to tackle the root causes and consequences of corruption and finding solutions for strengthening prevention, accountability, and redress, the impact of mainstreaming knowledge is a powerful approach to raise awareness, empower people, as well as foster positive mindsets for transforming lives. Corruption, we all know, directly or indirectly affects all individuals and societies and takes different shapes and nuances. Unfortunately, it impacts disproportionately on the most vulnerable people. It can cause detrimental effects on the enjoyment of human rights and set a very high hurdles for their promotion and protection. We know the magic mantra that human rights are universal, indivisible, interrelated, interdependent, and mutually reinforcing. But corruption can trigger a domino effect on civil, political, economic, social, and cultural rights by weakening the rule of law, weakening good governance at all levels, and hampering transparent, effective, and accountable institutions. Likewise, corruption can also reduce resources available to cover the needs of society and create vicious cycles towards immoral and unlawful practices. From our experience in UNITAR, which is the UN entity with the mandate of developing the individual, institutional, and organizational capacities of countries and other stakeholders, together with our rule of law and anti-corruption center, ROLAC, whose director is here with us today, Dr. Yasser Rafai. We have been working together on knowledge tools, focusing on anti-corruption and sustainable development, digital tools, and human rights. Our objective is to strengthen the competencies required at the individual and at collective levels to overcome some of the impacts caused by corruption. We take this opportunity to reiterate our deepest appreciation for our partnership with ROLAC. Ladies and gentlemen, excellencies, we consider that the UN Human Rights Council is the ideal place to celebrate this event. As the Human Rights Council is the intergovernmental body within the United Nations responsible for enhancing the promotion and protection of human rights everywhere. We commend its contribution to the respect, protection, and realization of human rights by covering such a wide range of related topics, including this issue of corruption. I just wanted, as an aside, to mention that when I was right in the midst of readying the world for the Sustainable Development Goals, we met a lot of resistance on Goal 16, particularly the sub-target there on corruption, where some of the countries argued that, look, corruption is a whip that richer and more developed countries beat us with. It is a political tool by referring to corruption. But then we polled 7 million people in a survey which was carried out in the UNDP. And guess what came on the top of people's concerns on human rights and other issues which were at the heart of the SDGs? It was corruption. And it was those very countries whose representatives were arguing in the General Assembly that corruption is a whip to beat poorer developing countries. But that was not true. Their own people had this great perception on how important corruption becomes when it comes to protecting dignity and human rights. We trust that this course and the virtual roundtable on anti-corruption and human rights will provide a good opportunity for reinforcing the knowledge of anyone who is interested in learning about the nexus between corruption and human rights. This will benefit delegates from states and other stakeholders who participate in the activities of this council, as well as those persons who are working on different national or international mechanisms, and persons who are familiar, and also those who are not so familiar with anti-corruption issues and human rights. I thank you all once again for joining us today, and I look forward to an interesting discussion. And I pass the floor back to the director of our People's Division, Mr. Alex Mejia, and I thank him and his staff who have made today's event possible. Thank you.
Thanks to you, Mr. Seth. It's always a pleasure to hear how this can actually impact lives and to make our planet better. With those welcoming and inaugural remarks, it is now my great pleasure to introduce you, the President of the United Nations Human Rights Council, and also the permanent representative of Fiji to the United Nations and other international organizations in Geneva. She will be joining us via video today. Ambassador Khan is rather busy, but she supports us in spirit completely and wholeheartedly. So to hear her message, Julia, perhaps you can take the floor. I think the video is ready. Thank you.
Excellencies, dear colleagues, Bulavinaka and good day. It is my honor to address you today at the opening of this virtual roundtable discussion and launch of the e-learning course entitled Anti-Corruption and Human Rights, Mainstreaming Anti-Corruption for the Effective Promotion and Protection of Human Rights. At the outset, I would like to thank the United Nations Institute for Training and Research and the Rule of Law and Anti-Corruption Center for organizing this roundtable. The roundtable aims to share good practices and challenges regarding the impact of good governance on building more equal, inclusive, and prosperous societies. I am certain that today's discussions will help to guide all stakeholders as they consider how to best ensure good governance with a view to promoting and protecting human rights. I also wish to commend UNITAR and ROLAC for having developed this e-learning course, which will provide states and other stakeholders with a comprehensive understanding of the links between corruption and human rights. The e-learning course accomplishes this through 4 insightful and instructive modules that examine the impact of corruption on human rights, the domino effect of corruption on all human rights, lessons learned by states and other actors regarding efforts to prevent and to combat corruption, and raising awareness regarding the detrimental effects of corruption on human rights. I would like to take this opportunity to encourage all stakeholders to engage with this e-learning course in order to strengthen their understanding of corruption and human rights and lessons learned in this regard. This virtual roundtable and e-learning course builds on the important work of the United Nations to combat and prevent corruption and its negative impacts on the full enjoyment of all human rights. As former United Nations Secretary General Kofi Annan wrote in his foreword to the United Nations Convention Against Corruption, corruption undermines democracy and the rule of law, leads to violations of human rights, distorts markets, erodes the quality of life, and allows organized crime, terrorism, and other threats to human security to flourish. The convention, which entered into force on the 14th of December 2005 and has 187 member states parties, works to combat and prevent these negative impacts by outlining member state obligations to, inter alia, implement coordinated anti-corruption policies, adopt such legislative and other measures as may be necessary to establish as criminal offences, corruption when committed intentionally, and to cooperate with one another in criminal matters in accordance with Article 44 on extradition and Article 50 on special investigative techniques. Complementing this convention, the Human Rights Council, over which I have the honour to preside this year, has shown a light on the connection between corruption and human rights. Indeed, since its 21st session in September 2012, the Council has adopted 7 resolutions on the negative impacts of corruption on human rights. Most recently, in June 2019, at its 41st session, the Council adopted a resolution entitled "The Negative Impact of Corruption on the Enjoyment of Human Rights," which mandated the United Nations High Commissioner to prepare a report on the challenges faced and best practices applied by states in integrating human rights into their national strategies and policies to fight against corruption. This report, which was presented last June, found that corruption is increasingly raised with United Nations human rights mechanisms as an obstacle to the realization of human rights and as a potential cause of human rights violations and abuse, and that as part of their duty to make the maximum use of available resources so as to realize all human rights, states have an obligation to combat corruption. Moreover, in March 2018, the Council adopted a resolution on the negative impact of corruption on the right to be free from torture and other cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment. Critically, this resolution recognized that the prevalence of corruption, including in law enforcement and justice systems, can have a negative impact on the fight against torture and other cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment. The resolution calls upon states to enhance their awareness of how the risk of corruption in the work of law enforcement personnel, judges, prosecutors, and other relevant public officials may increase the risk of torture and other cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment. I would also like to highlight 2 ways that the Council helps states to implement these resolutions and translate words into concrete improvements in the lives of people around the world. First is the Universal Periodic Review, or UPR, a peer review process during which the human rights record of each UN member state is examined. In the process, recommendations are offered on how the state under review could improve its human rights situation. To date, all 193 UN member states have been reviewed twice, and most have already completed their 3rd review. And many of the recommendations that have been given through the UPR process have addressed anti-corruption efforts. Second is the Council's Agenda Item 10, which focuses on technical assistance and capacity building. The resolutions adopted by the Council under this agenda item provide technical assistance and capacity building to various member states, often focusing on strengthening good governance efforts, which in turn reduces corruption and its negative impact on human rights. I would like to conclude by encouraging you all at this virtual workshop and during your engagement with the e-learning course to engage with the array of Council resources on corruption and human rights. And I would once again like to recognize UNITAR and ROLAC for organizing this virtual workshop and for developing this innovative e-learning course. Vinaka Bakalevu, and thank you.
Very good. We thank Ambassador Khan for those very holistic remarks, and especially for taking the time to join us today, even if it is virtually. Now, we will continue with the proceedings, and it's a great pleasure for me to introduce Dr. Yasser Refaie, the Director of the Rule of Law and Anti-Corruption Center in Doha, Qatar, Dr. Refai represents an organization that has been a steady, strong, and committed ally of UNITAR. All what you have seen and you will see has been made possible thanks to them. So without further ado, Dr. Refai, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Alex. Good afternoon. On behalf of His Excellency, Dr. Ali bin Ftais Al-Maghi, the United Nations Special Advocate for the Prevention of Corruption and Chairman, I'd like to welcome all distinguished speakers and participants to this virtual roundtable on anti-corruption and human rights and the accompanying launch of the e-learning course on the same theme. Delivered by the United Nations Institute for Training and Research in Geneva and the Rule of Law and Anti-Corruption Center in Doha. This is the second in a series of e-learning courses designed and delivered through the partnership between ROLAC and UNITAR. The first being the e-learning course on anti-corruption and sustainable development, which was launched in November 2020, thanks to the hard work of my dear friend and colleague Alex Mejia and his team, under the guidance of UNITAR's Executive Director, His Excellency Mr. Nikhithis. The first e-learning course was extremely successful, and I have no doubt that the course we are launching today will also be an extremely popular learning tool. There is no doubt that the greatest threat to global stability is corruption. This threat affects all sectors and all walks of life and is not limited to countries, governments, and public utilities, but extends to the private sector, multinational companies, and every part of the global economy. There is no doubt also that these effects also affect the extent to which individuals and societies are able to enjoy basic human rights as described and approved by international conventions, in particular the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Today, a global movement of organization and individual advocate for basic human rights for every person in every country, and has developed meanings, types, and concepts of what constitutes human rights, how they can be protected, developed, and who push for their implementation. At the same time, corruption is a crime subject to local laws, and therefore efforts to combat corruption must include strengthening and supporting criminal law mechanisms, law enforcement agency, and generally the effectiveness of the criminal justice system within each jurisdiction. Therefore, this training course seeks to explain the impact of corruption on human rights, such as the right to equality, the right to information, and the right to access justice. It highlights the role of victims in fighting corruption and how they can be supported by protecting them and protecting their rights. Additionally, the course highlights how the fight against corruption is not limited to punitive aspects, but also prevention and risk management. These rights, which the human rights which should allow men, women, and children in every country to live in freedom and security, are critical in our quest to improve the lives of the poorest and most vulnerable. Corruption to trust human rights. Therefore, this course will teach participants how to uncover the links between corruption and human rights and the challenges that countries that see fields may face. It will guide participants on how to enhance the skills needed to train others to fight corruption and uphold human rights, and explore case studies of countries that have succeeded in developing anti-corruption strategies that include the protection of human rights. I hope that you will find this virtual roundtable and e-learning course a useful e-learning experience that sheds light on responsibility that all of us have, the responsibility to protect human rights and to fight corruption. And I salute you for your commitment to improving your knowledge in this field. Thank you. Thank you very much. Alex, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Dr. Refai. Indeed, this is something tangible that ROLAC is doing through UNITAR, and its offer for, if I may refer to the participants joining us today from several countries, is for you. The idea of this e-learning and several others that I'm going to mention is simply to strengthen capacities. That is the mandate of UNITAR, the mandate of ROLAC as well. And we are basically structuring an invitation for you to join us. Remember that what you're going to see on the screen now, and I will deliver a very short presentation in that regard. We just want you to cement some couple of dates. You can go forward. Thank you, Julia. On the 5th of July, next week, we begin this e-learning course. So we are here indeed to conduct a panel that will raise awareness about the linkages and the importance of understanding anti-corruption from the perspective of human rights, but also to invite you to join us. So let me, before I begin, mention also in recognition to what Dr. Refaya just mentioned and what my Assistant Secretary General said at the beginning, that we are very pleased to launch this tool, and it's the second one that we have developed in partnership with ROLAC. The first one, perhaps some of you know, was the e-learning course on anti-corruption and sustainable development, building inclusive and transparent societies for all. As Mr. Seth referred to the importance of sustainable development, the Agenda 2030 and SDGs proper, that course focuses a little more on the whole. But now the second course, in its third iteration on anti-corruption and human rights, goes a little deeper on the linkages between both. So let me, if you can go to the next, Julia, slide, tell you what are the learning objectives of the course. The idea is that at the end of this e-learning, participants will be able to identify how anti-corruption efforts could strengthen the full enjoyment, protection, and promotion of human rights. Number two, that they are able to recognize the human rights challenges faced by individuals and societies for preventing and combating corruption. Number three, that they can describe different benefits and positive influence of preventing and combating corruption for the full enjoyment, promotion, and protection of human rights. And last but not least, amongst the learning objectives, the idea is that participants will be able to identify means for supporting anti-corruption efforts in both developed and developing countries and their links with human rights. Next, please, Julia. The modules, as you can see on the screen, number one is unrolling the links between anti-corruption and human rights proper. Number two, human rights challenges and corruption, very specific, getting into the root causes of corruption. Number three, module three, fostering adequate conditions for human rights through preventing and combating corruptions. And module four, strengthening skills for training on anti-corruption and human rights, very specific. Next, please. There is a question that perhaps I would like to address briefly behind this effort. Why did we decide to focus on human rights this time? Because corruption has a wide spectrum of possibilities that lead to human rights violations. Either there is a corrupt act deliberately used to violate the right, or there are actions that may lead to human rights violations, but which themselves are not a violation as such. We need to understand the whole in a holistic manner. The relationship between corruption and human rights is not limited, as you know, to the negative effects that the different forms of corruption have on the full enjoyment and exercise of human rights, and therefore on a state's compliance with their international obligations to guarantee and respect those rights. An additional dimension that is increasingly relevant, if I may say, is the dynamics of the interaction between human rights protection and the fight against corruption. There used to be two silos, and that's not the way to go. In this regard, over the years, fighting corruption has been added to the repertoire of competencies of international human rights bodies, and society as a whole is becoming empowered to demand its eradication. A variety of international bodies have already highlighted the ethical and legal contributions that international human rights law makes to the fight against corruption. We cannot talk about the effective promotion and protection of human rights without first ensuring a world that respects and considers the dignity of persons without discrimination from a holistic approach, and thus ensures the very existence of the future generations. So if you can go to the next, I think we have only 2 more slides. I really wanted to remind you that this is how you register. You go to unitar.org, or you simply Google this title, Anti-Corruption and Human Rights, UNITAR or ROLAC, and you will get to this page. Then the course, of course, has no fee. There is no registration fee, no tuition. You simply register for free, put in your data. And last but not least, I mentioned that we are going, thank you, to begin on the 5th of July. Registrations are already open and will be closed next Monday. So we do hope that you can join us. This is, as I said at the beginning, all for you. I am forgetting to mention, you are all working professionals and busy people, but remember that this is a self-paced course that is planned for 6 weeks, right? The idea is that it will be open from 5th July until the 15th of August 2021, but you do it at your own pace. So you have been invited. Now, let me perhaps go to the panel itself. If you can go to the next slide, Julia. And on behalf of Mr. Seth and on behalf of UNITAR, let me now open this important conversation. Next, Julia, please. For the first speaker of this panel, the first panelist, I am very pleased to say that she's a very close friend of UNITAR, Ambassador Socorro Flores, that we know very closely, was a member of the Board of Trustees of UNITAR. She was based in Geneva, is the former permanent representative of Mexico to the United Nations in this city. And nowadays, to a great honor, she is indeed a sitting judge of the International Criminal Court. So with that short introduction, and always welcoming you, Ambassador, es un placer. Usted tiene la palabra. Gracias.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Alex. I hope you can hear me.
Yes, indeed.
Yes, perfect. It's a real pleasure to be with you today, and I'm very grateful to UNITAR and to ROLAC for inviting me to this roundtable on human rights and anti-corruption, and to share the space with very distinguished and well-appreciated former colleagues. I feel extremely honored and privileged for having the opportunity to join you. A part of my heart remains in Geneva, and I always cherish the good moments I spend there. I also want to congratulate UNITAR and ROLAC for launching a course on anti-corruption and human rights. It is not an area that has been addressed in its full dimension, but there is no doubt that the impact of corruption in the enjoyment of human rights is deeply felt all over the world, and that even if it affects all persons, it has a particularly detrimental impact in the most vulnerable ones. It is vital to address corruption in all spaces, and I hope that the course that is just beginning will be really a good, very excellent outcome for the discussions in the future. Given the limitation of time, I would limit my remarks to 5 points, and I would be happy to further elaborate during the questions and answer section. And the first point is that fighting corruption is a legal and a moral obligation of all states. Governments are elected to pursue the public good, to take decisions based in the law, and that guarantee the respect of human rights of all persons within their jurisdictions. When the public authorities abuse their power for private gain, the consequences are felt by the very people they are supposed to serve. Those abuses may have different impacts depending on their magnitude, but all must be sanctioned as grave acts. I say this because corruption not only impacts the quality and accessibility of services authorities must provide, but also because it damages democracy and trust in public office and undermines sustainable development and the enjoyment of human rights. The second point is that governments are aware that corruption is a serious disease that must be eradicated. There are at least 21 main legal instruments where states commit to fight corruption at the national, international, and regional levels. However, it is a fact that states need to work harder to ensure the effective implementation of their legally binding commitments. There is no single state that supports corruption in their public positioning. But when it comes to investigations, prosecutions, and sentences, the reality tells a different story. UNODC, the UN body in charge of supporting the fight against corruption worldwide, has considered as key in all efforts to fight corruption the following areas: prevention, criminalization, international cooperation, and asset recovery and return in good faith of confiscated property to the state requesting it. All these areas need to be pursued by all states with the same degree of commitment if results are to be obtained. Sometimes we see more progress in some, like for example, criminalization and prevention, but much less in others, like asset recovery and return to the requesting state. If the progress in all areas is not perceived, the incentives to fight corruption may be eroded. But I also would like to add that efforts at the national and international level need to be constantly updated, particularly now when technology may create new ways to hide corruption. Let's not forget that corrupt officers and their accomplices take advantage of the many gray areas and of the international borders to their own benefit. The third point is that there is no sustainable development in societies where corruption is present. We have learned during this last decade that sustainable development and human rights are the two sides of the same coin. By promoting one, we are reinforcing the other, and by neglecting one, we are also neglecting the other. The adoption of the SDGs strengthens these interlinkages and makes clear that societies where respect for human rights is absent will never realize their full potential, and on the contrary, will see a detriment in the life quality of the people. More importantly, where corruption is present, the most vulnerable persons suffer the consequences the most. Their access to services as relevant as education, health, transport, and justice, among many others, are diminished, but also the rights such as freedom of expression and personal security as well. The fourth point relates to the importance of the judiciary in the efforts to eradicate corruption. There is no doubt that the only effective way to eradicate corruption is by eradicating impunity for its commission. And in this context, let me say some words about the ICC. The court, as you know, doesn't have jurisdiction on corruption per se. But when an act of corruption is committed within proceedings before the court, it must be investigated and prosecuted. That is the purpose of the offenses against the administration of justice defined in Article 7 of the statute, which include corruptly influencing an official of the court, corruptingly influencing a witness, or soliciting or accepting bribes as an official. Not many cases have been prosecuted so far, but the court remains vigilant to make sure that when they arise, they will be investigated. The only case on offenses against the administration of justice that has been concluded by the ICC so far, and I mean including on appeal, involve 5 persons, the main accused, members of his defense team, a close associate to the accused, and a witness that were prosecuted for having corruptly influenced witnesses and for presenting false evidence. The appeals chambers of the court confirmed the conviction on corruption, but reversed the conviction on false evidence. And the last point, but not least, is the role of civil society in visibilizing the different forms of corruption and their impacts in societies and in the enjoyment of human rights, and of course, and in their calls for accountability. Major corruption cases have been the result of investigations launched and pursued by civil society groups. Not all governments accept easily that they have corrupt officers, and without the push of civil societies, many situations would remain invisible. In addition, the very fact of denouncing and highlighting the effect of corruption in the quality of life and services of persons has a very positive effects in the short, medium, and long term, particularly in societies that accept corruption as a fact of life and that with their own attitude contribute to perpetuate the vicious circle of corruption. This is one of the reasons that I'm delighted with the course that will be launched today, and I wish all success. And I hope that it continues many, many times, because we need to continue discussing corruption in all spaces. I think I have finished my time. Thank you so much, Alex, but I'm really happy to elaborate at a later stage. Thank you for your attention, and back to you.
Thank you very much, Your Honor. Excellency, it's been a pleasure to hear this very unique approach to what we should actually be debating today. We will come back to you at the end with some questions and answers. Let me now go to our second panelist, Dr. Cecile Abtel. She is the Chief of the Rule of Law and Democracy Section of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. She's also Associate Professor of International Law at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. As a leading expert in international criminal justice, transitional justice, and child rights, she has over 20 years experience in legal policy and humanitarian matters, working for several UN entities in the past, the European Union, and several think tanks and NGOs. Without further ado, let me now offer you the floor, Dr. Cecile Abtel. Welcome.
Thank you very much. It's a true honor to be here discussing such an important topic and with such a distinguished panel as well. And I'm really especially delighted as well to be taking the floor just after Judge Flores, who I always remember keenly. You're very much missed in Geneva. We have already been mentioning the importance and the relationship between human rights and corruption. Every year, an estimated $1 trillion is paid in bribes and 2.6 trillion are stolen through corruption. This is a total sum equivalent to more than 5% of the global GDP. No country, no region, no community is immune. Corruption has a devastating impact on the enjoyment of human rights. It is a serious crime that undermines the full spectrum of human rights, civil and political, social, economic, and cultural rights in all societies. As eloquently indicated by Ambassador Han, the President of the Human Rights Council, it is clear that the prevalence of corruption weakens human rights. The United Nations Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights promotes a human rights-based approach to anti-corruption, an approach that puts the international human rights entitlements, the rights holders, and the corresponding obligations of the state, the duty bearers, at the center of anti-corruption efforts at all levels. A 2016 report entitled Compilation of Best Practices of Efforts to Counter the Negative Impact of Corruption on the Enjoyment of All Human Rights concluded that states are duty-bound to combat corruption, since corruption has a negative impact on the enjoyment of human rights and can lead to or directly constitute human rights violations. Conversely, the promotion and protection of human rights and anti-corruption efforts are mutually reinforcing. While the fight against corruption offers the proper conditions for the effective exercise of human rights, the fulfillment of human rights leaves no room for the existence of corruption. So the quest for human rights and justice requires ending impunity for corruption, especially ground corruption. Next slide, please. Corruption often arises during crisis, particularly when public institutions are weak. And we often see that in conflict setting. We have also been witnessing it with the COVID-19 pandemic. This pandemic has exacerbated pre-existing corrupt practices. In addition, new risks have emerged. All business sectors are exposed to corruption in fragile environments all along the supply chain. Procurement of medicines and supplies for health systems is an area vulnerable to corruption like all others. The pandemic makes responsible, coherent, and coordinated action on business and human rights and corruption urgent, as was pointed out by the Working Group of the UN on the issue of human rights and transnational corporations and other business enterprises. Also, as a response to the COVID-19 crisis, governments around the world have allocated billions of dollars of public funds to pandemic responses, emergency assistance, and economic relief. They have also at times ignored or even suspended existing transparency, accountability, and anti-corruption enforcement mechanisms. There is always a high risk that funds be siphoned off by corrupt leaders and their associates. Next slide, please. Despite the UN Convention Against Corruption, UNCAC, which we've already mentioned, a legally binding universal instrument, in many countries, leaders use their control of the police and sometimes even of prosecutors and judges to provide impunity for those engaged in ground corruption. This is when international human rights law provides a helpful toolbox, as it is fundamentally about the obligations of states and those who hold political authority and power. The International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the ICCPR, the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, set forth binding legal obligations on states regarding the human rights affected by corruption. For example, Article 2 of the ICCPR requires states parties to respect and to ensure the right recognized in the Covenant and to take the necessary steps to give effect to those rights. As such, states should provide an effective remedy to individuals when their rights are violated, including by corruption, and provide a fair and effective judicial or administrative mechanism for the determination of individual rights or their violations. I also list on this slide the guiding principles on business and human rights. While they do not focus specifically on corruption, they address corruption in the context of accountability and access to remedy. They make clear that procedure for the provision of remedy should be impartial, protected from corruption, and free from political or other attempts to influence the outcome. Mentioning also the UN Code of Conduct for law enforcement officials, which in Article 7 states that law enforcement officials shall not commit any act of corruption. They shall also rigorously oppose and combat all such acts. Turning to the next slide, anti-corruption and the right to participation. Why pointing to this? Because as pointed out by the Human Rights Committee, states party to the ICCPR have an obligation under Article 25 to fight and eradicate corruption to guarantee effective participation in public affairs. States should ensure that all cases of corruption are independently and impartially investigated. Prevention of corruption also entails transparency in campaign financing. Transparency in campaign finance and expenditure disclosure and access to information is needed to ensure equality amongst all candidates, including members of the oppositions and parties, so that voters are presented with a free choice. So clearly, to build resilience against corruption during a pandemic, we need to ensure that states continue to respect the right to participate. This takes me really to the important setback that we've seen as part of the COVID-19 in terms of emergency and security measures being taken. While in most cases they have been needed to fight the virus, they can also be politically driven and may be easily abused. The pandemic has sometimes provided a pretext to undermine democratic institutions and quash legitimate dissent or disfavored people or groups with far-reaching consequences. All of these provide fertile ground for corruption. Next slide, turning to media freedom and safety of journalists. We know that a free, uncensored, and independent press is a cornerstone of democratic societies. Journalists and the media are crucial to ensure transparency and accountability and play a key role in exposing corruption. Yet, journalists and media workers are facing threats due to their investigative work, including when they document and expose corruption. So just closing out now with the next slide to say that within this framework, the rule of law and good governance are key to converge the benefits and challenges of both human rights and corruption, and anti-corruption's effort. The COVID-19 pandemic has reversed hardly gains worldwide and magnified pre-existing forms of discriminations, inequalities, but any crisis offers opportunities. This is the time to revive efforts to foster the rule of law and good governance. This is a time to consider how new mechanisms can be created to share further information and monitor the use of public funds, the implementations of policies. Ultimately, building back better is about more accountability, more transparency, and more participation. These efforts will shape anti-corruption measures. They have to be grounded in human rights and will then contribute to entrenching human rights. Thank you.
Thanks to you, Dr. Abtel. We will come back with a couple of questions that we have already been receiving from panelists. Let me now introduce Professor Carlos Correa, the Executive Director of the South Center. Among other things, Dr. Correa has a wide and well-respected experience on trade and intellectual property and also on technology issues. Some years ago, he worked with the Argentine government and was the director of the Center for Interdisciplinary Studies on Industrial Property and Economics at the Law Faculty of the University of Buenos Aires. Professor Correa is a good friend and a strategic ally of UNITAR. It is my great pleasure to offer you the floor. Dr. Correa, welcome.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Mejia. Thank you for inviting the South Center to participate in this event. The South Center, as you know, is an intergovernmental organization of developing countries. It was established by developing countries and works for developing countries. And certainly the issue of corruption is of incredible importance for developing countries in order to organize a fight against that. Much has already been said in relation to the relationship between corruption and the realization of human rights. Let me just add a few observations. Some of them are related to the comments that were already made. The first one is that combating corruption is critical to achieve SDGs. This has already been mentioned. It is interesting that Target 16, paragraph 5, and Mr. Seth referred to this before, reads, substantially reduce corruption and bribery in all forms. Perhaps this target is not as ambitious as one would wish. It is not just to reduce corruption. We need to eliminate corruption. Corruption is morally unacceptable. It is also unacceptable under the law, be it national law or international law. It certainly harms the efforts that countries make, in particular developing countries make, for the realization of human rights. So there are some statistics, some of them have already mentioned, but clearly there are direct effects in terms of realization of human rights, of corruption, and there are also indirect effects. Just to mention two. Direct effects is the fact that corruption reduces the tax revenues of states, and therefore the capacity to deal with poverty, to deal with development of social protection diminishes significantly. So corruption affects not only states, and this is very important to be emphasized. Sometimes the perception is that the victims of corruption are the governments or the states. The real victims are the people, not the states themselves. Indirect effects, for instance, can be seen in terms of market distortion. This was also mentioned before. The existence of corruptions deter new investments. It deter entrepreneurship. It creates what may be called a hidden tax that will limit competition and innovation, and therefore the people will suffer from this. So a third observation is that certainly the fight against corruption should be done under the law, be it national or international law. Moral rules are very important. So ethical rules are very important, but they are not sufficient. And unfortunately, some societies, there is some tolerance vis-a-vis corruption. So we need a very strong legal system in order to fight corruption. There is, in some cases, the need to develop legal instruments, in particular legal instruments. But also, as it was already mentioned, there is a need to implement these instruments in an appropriate manner. And in this sense, the existence of an independent judiciary is crucial. So what objectives these legal instruments should help to achieve? In the first place, to prevent corruption. And transparency is a fundamental principle in order to achieve that. Second, to avoid impunity. And as we know, in many cases, corruption acts remain impune, but these are criminal acts and these should be condemned. The third place, and this is very important, I will emphasize this, legislation on international law should enable recovery of stolen assets. This is crucial. It's not enough just to condemn the actors of corruption. It is important for our countries to be able to recover the money that has been sent illegally, for instance, to other jurisdictions. And the fourth objective, is also important, is to deny safe havens, both to offenders and the proceeds of the crimes. So these four objectives should be present in any legal effort in order to address corruption. So a fourth comment, and I will focus now on one particular way in which corruption takes place, and this is the illicit financial flows. As you know, it has been studied, it has been documented. For instance, the UNCTAD report for 2020 in relation to Africa has estimated that Africa loses almost $90 billion annually as a result of illicit financial flows. So these flows have a tremendous negative impact in the countries. There is one estimate made by UNDP, in accordance to which the illicit financial flows exceed the funds which are provided by development aid. So there is a huge loss for developing countries. And I hope that UNCTAD or other organizations may continue to collect that data, not only in relation to Africa, but to other continents. So a fifth observation I'd like to make is about international cooperation. It has been mentioned, but this is key. Without international cooperation, it is not possible to fight corruption. in particular in case in which different jurisdictions are involved in these crimes. In order to increase this cooperation, some of the instruments that were already mentioned can be used. There may be also a need to develop new instruments. For instance, the proposed legally binding instrument in relation to transnational corporations and human rights might also include some provisions that may help to fight corruption in the context of human rights. This international cooperation should be there in order to prevent corruption in the first place, to identify cases of corruption, and for the recovery of assets. And my last comment relates to the fact that sometimes it is thought that corruption may be fought at the national level on the basis of a specific law, an anti-corruption law. This may be an important step, but this may not be enough. It is crucial to streamline anti-corruption policies in all legislation, in practices of the administration at the national and subnational level. So a single law will not solve the problem. And secondly, if legislation is adopted, as suggested before, it is crucial to ensure that this is effectively implemented. And for this, there is a need of continuous assessment of the level of implementation of the law or the policies. There is a need to invest in the skills of the people. In some cases, dealing with cases is technically very complex. As was mentioned, some sophisticated technologies are used. It is necessary to invest, but this investment will pay off because this may prevent major losses that the countries and the people may suffer. So thank you very much again for inviting the South Center to this event. As I mentioned, it is for us a critical issue, the fight against anti-corruption, and I hope that this course will help to disseminate knowledge in order to pursue these actions at the national and international level. Thank you very much.
Thanks to you, Dr. Correa, Professor Correa. We appreciate that you are here, and we very much respect the South Center, as you know. We will come back in the Q&A at the end. Now, without further ado, it's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Zaman Zia Zarifi, the Secretary General of the International Commission of Jurists. He has an impressive career as a doctor in law, but before he served with Amnesty International as the Director for Asia and the Pacific, and he has been with this organization for almost 20 years, or more than a decade, excuse me. He was at Human Rights Watch since 2000, where he was first Deputy Director of Asia, and then, as I mentioned, the Director for Asia and the Pacific. He has several publications on liability of multinational corporations under international law. He was also a litigator in Los Angeles in the United States of America after graduating from Cornell Law School in 1993. It's an honor and a pleasure to have you, Mr. Secretary General. The floor is yours. Welcome.
Thank you very much for that introduction, and what a pleasure to participate in this roundtable. Thank you to UNITAR and ROLAC, and it is wonderful to be among such esteemed
I think we are having some technical complications. Can you hear us? Hello? Dr. Zia, can you hear us?
I can.
Yes. So just a small suggestion.
I can hear you perfect.
Thank you so much. You are coming on and off to us, and I apologize for this. Maybe if you stop your video, it will be easier. Is that okay?
I will try. Can you hear me?
Yeah, now we can hear you well. Please go ahead.
Okay, I will try. Of course, this is also part of the experience of the pandemic. I do wish that I could be with all of you in person. And to address the impact of the pandemic on corruption and the rule of law, and more important, maybe to discuss the idea of building back better. We have heard very eloquently and clearly already about the importance of corruption on human rights. Of course, corruption is itself parasitic. It is fundamentally at odds with the rule of law. It stops the ability of states and society to protect and preserve and promote human rights. And it is often also a human rights violation in and of itself. The International Commission of Jurists for the last 70 years has been fighting against corruption and defending the rule of law and human rights. And in the context of the pandemic, let me focus, if I may, on one aspect of how we can and should respond to corruption during the time of COVID and how we can build back better. And you will not be surprised to hear from the International Commission of Jurists that we think a crucial part of the approach to building back better has to be strengthening the independence and accountability of the judiciary and of the legal system. We have all heard that corruption, of course, is a long-standing problem globally and historically, and about the impact of corruption in terms of presenting an obstacle to the promotion and protection of human rights, something, for instance, that the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights and its General Comment 24 on Business and Human Rights pointed out, that corruption constitutes a major obstacle to the protection and promotion of human rights, particularly as regards the activities of businesses and private enterprise. It undermines the state's ability to mobilize resources. It leads to discriminatory access to public service in favor of those able to influence authorities, including those who can offer bribes, and it targets the marginalized and those without access to such resources. And unfortunately, we absolutely saw the manifestation of these problems during the COVID pandemic in the last 18 months or so. The pandemic and the state responses to it offered ample opportunities for corruption. There was massive amounts of emergency procurement going on. There were, in many cases, economic stimulus put into the economy. And of course, the economic impact and pressure of the pandemic created huge need, and therefore the opportunity for corruption. And of course, we saw this throughout the world. The ICJ's work documenting the impact of the pandemic around the globe has documented corruption and complaints of corruption everywhere, from the wealthiest countries, the United States, the United Kingdom, the European Union, around the world. India, in Nepal, we documented it, multiple countries in Africa. And we have heard already, of course, that corruption has been the subject of numerous international conventions and regional conventions, the UN Convention Against Corruption, the Council of Europe's Criminal Law Convention on Corruption, the OECD, the African Union Convention on Preventing and Combating Corruption, the Inter-American Convention Against Corruption. So it is not for lack of international attention, but we have to face the fact that despite many of these conventions coming into force and many countries signing up to them, the need for accountability remains despite increasing calls and use of criminal action, even private actions in some cases, that corruption has remained a problem. And this is why we are absolutely supportive of the call by the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights that responding to traditional corruption requires something beyond just the criminal focus on the perpetrator. something beyond individual criminal responsibility and suppression. And the High Commissioner has asked for a human rights-based approach in response to corruption, which means focusing on the victim and on state responsibility and on prevention and redress. And I just want to refer here to the statement of the European Network of National Human Rights Institutions, which clarified that a human rights-based approach demonstrates 5 key human rights principles: participation of the public, accountability and transparency, non-discrimination and equality, empowerment of rights holders, and legality. And the advantage of this, especially as we saw during COVID, and we hope as we emerge from the pandemic, is that it empowers the ordinary people to demand transparency, accountability, and responsibility, and therefore makes the fight against corruption part of the social fabric instead of purely accepted, as we often see in countries around the world, particularly, I must point out, as has already been addressed, in the developing world, where corruption is at risk, in fact, in many places, is accepted simply as part of doing business, and the people expect it. And it is unfortunate that the ICJ has also documented this notion of corruption within the judiciary itself. The UN Special Rapporteur on the Independence of Judges and Lawyers has emphasized that judicial corruption erodes principles of independence and impartiality and integrity of the judiciary. It infringes on the right to a fair trial, and it undermines the credibility of the justice system. And in doing so, it undermines the trust of the people in their government, in their social system, to respond to crises like the pandemic in a fair and rational and legal way. We really saw this problem in the most recent report of the Special Rapporteur on the Independence of Judges and Lawyers, who documented how the pandemic has severely undermined the functioning of judicial systems. In many countries, shutting down the judiciary was one of the first actions. The impact has been uneven, but it has been disproportionately severe for vulnerable groups. For instance, we have seen documented a huge rise in violence, domestic violence, sexual and gender-based violence, and the inability of women in particular who have suffered such incidents from getting access to the courts. So in line with the Special Rapporteur on the Independence of Judges, we have to say, what can we do? And it's in this regard that the ICJ suggests that in responding to crises like this, we have to go back to such basic notions as strengthening the independence of the judiciary. And part of the independence and part of the impartiality of the judiciary is the accountability of the judiciary. So there are 2 levels that of action that we have to see. These are concepts that, of course, were in place before the pandemic, but the pandemic has emphasized the need for these responses and gives us an opportunity, perhaps, to build back better. In the UN Convention Against Corruption, I just want to remind everyone, Article 11 highlights the importance of the independence of the judiciary and its crucial role in combating corruption. And in 2015, the UN Office on Drugs and Crime, UNODC, published an implementation guide for Article 11, and it really focused on fighting corruption in the justice sector. So one level of corruption in the justice sector is simply bribery, not just of judges, but also lawyers, of court clerks, simply for access to courthouse processes. The second, of course, at a higher level is political interference, including pressure from the executive or the legislative. And over the last 18 months during the pandemic, we have seen both those types of corruption in the judiciary significantly across the world. So what are the responses? What can be done? Well, again, these are concepts that we have tried, the ICJ, as well as colleagues in the UN system and regional systems have tried to fight. We rely on the 1985 United Nations Principles on the Independence of Judiciary, and along the work of what is called the Bangalore Principles of Judicial Conduct. These were principles that were developed by a group of chief justices and judges from around the world, and they use the notion of judicial integrity. So here we have a system where, while acknowledging and defending the independence of the judiciary as a separate branch of the government, making sure that the judiciary itself has the capacity and the political support to fight judiciary within the judicial system. This is crucial. This requires budgetary support, but more than anything, it requires the support of the executive and the legislative in countries around the world to empower the judiciary to do this. It also requires cooperation of civil society, of the media that we heard about, in being able to monitor and report on instances of judicial corruption and to demand response from the judiciary. And if then necessary, if a particular infraction goes beyond what is appropriate for the judiciary to deal with, to look at individual and criminal responsibility and accountability in line with the conventions that we have already talked about. As the UN Special Rapporteur on Independence of Judges pointed out in his report, it is absolutely essential for countries to look at what happened during the pandemic, to identify the judiciary and the legal system as essential actors, and to ensure moving forward that we have in place the tools to address future situations like the pandemic. As we all know, unfortunately, it is more than likely that we will face further such issues in the future. And here, finally, to look at and strengthen across the world at access to the judiciary through digital and remote models. This is something that we have seen, and something that actually does not require a tremendous amount of money. This doesn't mean building more courthouses, but rather ensuring that the digital divide between those who have access to the internet and those who don't is decreased, and that the judiciaries are capable of providing access to people in their countries within the systems that exist, and to strengthen these systems. And meanwhile, to also put in place efforts to make sure that these new systems can respond to problems of corruption. In many cases, we think that actually moving to these systems will decrease the possibility of corruption. So to conclude, the pandemic has highlighted the long-standing issues of corruption in the judiciary, of corruption, and the need for the judiciary to be able to respond and control corruption. And we hope that this is sent off an alarm bell and will therefore require government to strengthen the independence and integrity and accountability of their judiciaries in response to the pandemic now and in response to inevitable future threats and crises that will arise. Thank you very much.
Thanks to you, Dr. Zia. A very holistic analysis. This concludes our panel, but now we go to a round of questions and answers before the closing remark, Julia. And we wanted to kindly ask you for a small favor now. If you can, please put your camera on. We will be very pleased to put on the UNITAR website this picture of all the panelists, and of course also on social media. So perhaps Julia, if you can help us taking a picture that would be indeed very good. You tell us when. Very good. I think we are ready. Thanks. It's important to also publicize all these things that we do. Very good. We have some questions based on what the floor and what the audience has been virtually presenting. There are also some comments that are quite showing. I think all the panelists were able to see these comments. How corruption and human rights is really a topic on the top list of what societies debate. There are some comments from Nigeria and other countries in Latin America expressing frustration on how the fight against corruption and the protection of human rights perhaps is somehow slow. So we have distilled these things, and we have 4 questions. The first one is of course, for Her Excellency Ambassador Flores, George Flores. And if I may, I will tell you now what we have captured. The question is as follows. How can international bodies and mechanisms assist citizens in removing illegal bans on social media, bearing in mind the freedom of expression? So how can we help societies, we as the United Nations, you as the International Criminal Court, and other bodies and mechanisms help with these issues of freedom of discourse and also freedom of communication on social media, removing illegal bans? To you, Excellency, it will be very interesting to hear your opinion. I think we have you muted. Sorry, yes, just the microphone.
Okay, I think you can hear me now. Well,
yes, indeed.
Thank you. Thank you very, very much, Alex, and thank you very much for the question. I certainly know the many challenges that civil society faces precisely to make a visible acts of corruption. But I think it's an extremely important avenue that needs to be pursued. And I think that's why having these conversations in public spaces and reaching as much as possible the civil society all over the world is very important. We know that there are many discussions regarding what is the use of social media and what is permissible and what not, and that discussion will continue. And I'm not very sure if it will go to a kind of consensual outcome, because we know how difficult it is to regulate media. But I don't think we have to be waiting until that discussion is over to continue working and to continue visibilizing the importance of fighting corruption and the importance of letting people know about the consequences it has. So this is a good example, the course that is starting, but also the work that the Human Rights Council does in visibilizing. And that has to go not only to the area of human rights, it has to be everywhere, because corruption really has an impact in all parts of life. So, and I know there is an ongoing discussion whether corruption in itself constitutes a violation of human rights or not. And I think this is a discussion ongoing. But what is important is whatever the name is provided, we know that corruption has an impact, a very deep impact in the enjoyment of human rights. And I think that now that we have the SDGs, the linkages are so clear that simply civil society needs to continue highlighting in all spaces. I am sure that the messages get through, whether they are or know the media, but I think it's also important to highlight this at the international level to make sure that this visibilization is clearly understood by all. Thank you, Alex.
Thank you, Excellency, indeed. An excellent way to see it. Let me go now to the second question for Dr. Aptel, and I read now. What are the current initiatives that the OHCHR, the Office of High Commission of Human Rights, has for strengthening the rule of law and good governance, for combating corruption How can people support this effort? So rather specific, but very important to understand a little better the work that you lead. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you to whoever asked this question, because the very way it is worded demonstrates that corruption is really an issue for all of us, and one where each of us can really participate. So the first aspect of the question, what OHCHR is doing, we have a host of programs and work to strengthen rule of law institutions and democracy. And that includes capacity strengthening, working with states collaboratively when we can, organizing, in fact, a number of review of legislations, advice on constitutional reform legislations, other types of legislations, for instance, just to mention a few which may be related to corruption, regarding the organization of the judiciary, the independence of the judiciary, which was something mentioned as part of the presentation. We also have specific activities pertaining directly to corruption or anti-corruption initiatives that are often done in partnerships with other UN organizations, including some here. So a host of work, capacity strengthening, reporting on it, and there were quite a few mentioned here, to work ongoing at the Human Rights Council, which is supported by the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, and also participating to exposing corruption through a number of reports that are issued by the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, directly, also sometimes through the country team, the UN country team on the ground, through the work of the human rights advisors as part of the UN country team in a number of countries. The second part of the question is what can you do? What can each of us do? And really plenty. I mean, in fact, corruption is something where we need to all assemble our forces coming from different perspectives. So what the United Nations can do, what the judiciary can do, has to also be supported and relayed by what everyone does. I saw that there were questions and comments pertaining to the role of youth. I think that youth, any organization, civil society in general, individuals can do a lot in terms of bringing visibilities to acts of corruption when they exist, demand accountability, seek redress. I also briefly pointed out in my presentation on the role of journalists, the role of media freedom and freedom of information. This is an area where, there again, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights does a lot, together with other, including UNESCO, for instance, on really ensuring that media freedom, freedom of expressions, and the right to participation are guaranteed, that they are promoted and protected. And we have done a lot in terms of the safety of journalists. I referred to the fact that there's been journalists that have exposed corruptions or allegations of corruptions that have been facing threats due to that investigative work. So the OHCHR issues regular reports. Sometimes they are Secretary General reports. For instance, one in 2019 indicated that there were many journalists that were in fact killed, not only threatened, but killed during that reporting period, who had been reported on organized crimes, on local politics and corruptions. And very often it's very local. Yes, it's really at the local level. And many had received threats. Really, what all of us can do is also, just ensure that we have full respect for these right to participate, media freedom and freedom of expression that underpin the capacity to have anti-corruption efforts.
Very well said indeed. To everyone listening today, and not only now, by the way, I forgot to say at the beginning, there are hundreds of people that hear to these deliberations later on our YouTube channel, on Facebook Live, and after the fact. So to whoever is listening now or later, you can be part of the solution. Dr. Abdel say, please join us. You can make a difference. Thank you for that. Let me go now to Professor Correa. And Professor Correa, I particularly admire, and we all know the impressive work of the South Center that you lead on several issues, but I want to talk about tax and taxation, and you're one of the global leaders in this conversation, because you all understand that corruption robs opportunities from people, and sometimes tax evasion indeed is one of the most causes of corruption. And we also know that human rights needs to be ensured and maintained by ensuring that there is opportunities for people, right? So especially in developing nations, this is the question that we receive. Can you share some good practices for developing countries in avoiding or diminishing tax evasion, especially in the context of this current pandemic? So what should we do, Professor Correa?
Well, thank you for this very relevant question. Indeed, tax avoidance or evasion are major problems for developing countries. And in fact, as you mentioned, the South Center is doing a lot of work in this area. In particular, this phenomenon is aggravated in the context of the so-called digital economy, because many digital companies do businesses in our countries, but they do not pay taxes in our countries. So discussion is going on at international level in order to change the taxing rules and assert the taxing rights of developing countries. So there are many examples that may be mentioned. Perhaps there isn't time right now to do that, but we have a program of South-South cooperation in the area of taxation, in the context of which there is an exchange of information and knowledge among tax administrations of developing countries. For instance, recently has been one with Bolivia, Indonesia, Brazil. And this allows tax administrations of developing countries to know about new methodologies to deal with transfer pricing, for instance, which is a practice quite commonly used, and to introduce reforms in the tax systems in order to prevent this situation. This is a very serious area, and certainly is very much linked to the capacity of the states to get revenues in order to realize human rights, and therefore it's a critical part of any national strategy in the context of COVID-19, the recovery, and beyond that.
Very good. Thank you. A very holistic approach. Last but not least, let me present to you, Mr. Secretary General, a question also taken from the floor. It says, what aspects can you highlight regarding liability of multinational corporations under international law in combating corruption for the effective promotion and protection of human rights? We know that you have a unique expertise when it comes to multinational corporations and the private sector and the linkages with law. Can you give us some comments on how we can tackle this issue, please?
Thank you very much for that question. And it goes to the heart of this issue of corruption, because in many cases it is driven by private enterprise and unfortunately by large multinational corporations. This has been the subject, as you know, of the OECD convention, and businesses themselves are increasingly aware of the very high cost that they are paying in terms of dealing with corruption. And yet businesses, as you would expect, very often want to reject efforts by states to provide transnational responsibility. And so the difficulty is when we see one corporation operating, misoperating, engaging in corruption and bribery, they are subject under the OECD convention potentially to penalties and punishment, but not really in terms of the human rights violations that come from that corruption. And part of that is being addressed now. We are seeing increasingly states putting in place, under the concept of universal jurisdiction, efforts to address corruption when there is a clear link between that corruption and human rights violations. And we are seeing increasing calls, for instance, in the context of a global treaty on business and responsibility of businesses for violations that does address bribery and corruption. And it is some good news that I think international attitudes towards that treaty have changed. Initially, we had seen, for instance, many of the northern countries, the richer countries where many of the corporations are based, fighting this idea, but their own companies are reporting to them that they are facing a competitive disadvantage as they go up against corporations from countries that don't have the same level of protection and anti-corruption activity, these companies are suffering. And so we need a global response. We need to allow people who have suffered from corruption to be able to pursue their claims against those corporations where those corporations themselves sit. We have seen that increasingly happen with human rights violations, and I believe that it's inevitable that we will see that happen also with corruption, and it's a move that the ICJ supports, and we will fight for it at the national, regional, and global level.
Very good. Thank you for those answers, all of you. Quite unique to have you here. This is a very important ensemble, very rarely found. And I would like to express our appreciation. Now, as we're about to run out of time, we have literally 2 minutes before the 1 hour and a half that we are committed here to observe. Let me just invite everyone again, everyone listening today to this new e-learning course that we are launching on anti-corruption and human rights. Remember, the course starts on the 5th of July. It goes over for 6 weeks until the 15th of August of this year. There is no cost or obligation, but I assure you, it's indeed something worth investing your time. You will see that in this course, there are useful readings, videos, curious facts, notes, graphics, and the like, more than 100 references, if I remember correctly, that are very specific on the interlink between these two topics, as well as several sources and other tools that can help you. So please join us with this course. You can receive a certificate of participation in the end. And with that, on behalf of UNITAR and ROLAC, I would like to thank you for joining us, but not before also mentioning Mr. Shariar Arjani and Dr. Yasser Rifaye. Shariar, it's a pleasure to work with you out of Doha. And my own team as well should be mentioned, Ms. Ana Lucia Jacome, the project leader for anti-corruption at UNITAR, and Ms. Julia Gent, who has put us together today. So with that, on behalf of the United Nations Institute for Training and Research and all the panelists and also ROLAC, thank you so much for joining us today. This meeting is adjourned and we appreciate your presence. We wish you a good day. Thank you. Thank you.